Welcome, guys, to the Dodgy Idealist. And today I have a guest with me, a special guest actually. We are sort of in the same chat group, the infamous Cows of Chaos. Uh, Martin Kuhn, do you want to introduce
Yeah.
yourself?
Good evening. Yeah, thanks for having me, Dodgy. Yeah, my name's Martin, and just want to have a chat about one or two issues,
That's,
basically.
that's great. Our discussion tonight is going to go around systemic racism. Martin actually contacted me after I, I said that the video or the live stream from DNA and her guest on this very topic was great. Now, he has differing views, and I want to hear them. And I'm sure everyone wants to hear that as well. So, Martin, in that discussion, and in the discussion we just had in private, you said that your first issue with that, how can I say, live stream was the way that they defined systemic racism. Can you explain a little more for us?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, basically, firstly, the discussion that there was nothing, I had no issue with what they discussed. The issue that where my issue came in is how they define systemic racism. So they use the definition that is basically just institutionalized racism. So, especially the guest that was on the show, that's how the discussion was structured. It was basically they discussed institutionalized racism.
Hmm.
But if you look at the definition of the word systemic in Webster's dictionary or any one of those dictionaries, it gives you two. One is the original description or explanation of the word systemic, which is almost like indigenous to an organism or something that occurs naturally or is ever occurring in an organism. And then the other one was added, the other definitions were added recently, relatively recently, which is, and all the citations they use for those definitions comes from your activist spheres, people like Bree Newsom and so on, where they say no, but it's part of a system, it's part of a structure, it's part of uh, corporate structure and government structures and stuff like that, which is not. It's just it's just another way of saying it's institutionalized racism. So, because if you apply the word systemic to something like an occurrence like racism, it's something that's not defined by laws. So there's no laws that say you have to act in a certain way that would be considered racist. Um, it's it's something that occurs almost naturally, almost organic, and that's basically what systemic is. It's something that occurs in an organic fashion in an organism. And just to be clear, I do think you do. Well, I have do get systemic racism in societies, especially if you take South Africa, for instance. You do get that, but it's not in the way that it's being discussed in general.
Okay.
Because, yeah,
All right. So it's very fascinating because the dictionary that I first and foremost use is the Advanced English Dictionary,
mm,
and very interesting. The definition that it gives for systemic, for example, right? Let's hover over that topic for
mm,
a while, just so that the people can understand why you say that there is a difference. Because I can see why you say that, and I tend to agree with you. Um, so systemic in the AED is defined as affecting an entire system. So this could also apply to society at large. So it aligns more with Webster's, as you explained, Webster's first definition of systemic. Do you agree with that?
yes,
Okay. So for me, systemic racism then means something that is prevalent within the entire system, within the entire society. This is just not, in my opinion, it does not necessarily only stop within the society, it can also lead towards institutionalized racism. Racism that is prevalent within governmental structure, if that is the distinction that you're trying to make.
yes,
All right. So we're on the same page. Okay.
yes.
All right. I'm going to leave it then again to you to continue your previous thought. The floor is yours.
Yeah, like you just said, a systemic. The way I see the systemic racism, it could lead to institutionalized racism. But I think if you want to go and differentiate between something that's the racism that's institutionalized, and systemic racism, in my opinion at least, systemic racism will be something along the lines of, to give you for instance, someone breaks into your car. Okay, so now you're going to get to your car, you're going to see your car's broken into, going to be very upset and everything. Now, if you are, how can I say, a systemic racist, let's use that very, very unfitting term. It's not quite the right one, but in any case, um, systemic racism, if you are sort of susceptible to that, you would immediately assign a race to the criminal that broke into your car. Now, and you do get that in South Africa. Excuse me. You do get that.
Yes.
I'm sure most people in South Africa knows at least one person, usually a bit older person in general, that would immediately assign a race to criminals in general. Now, in South Africa, for instance, yes, statistically, a criminal will more likely be of a certain race. Statistically, that's just a fact. But it's not a fact. If you don't have any evidence, any video footage or whatever, you have no way of knowing for certain what's the race of that criminal. So if you just assume the race of the criminal without any evidence, in my opinion, that'll be a perfect example of systemic racism.
Yes.
Because even though it's supported by facts that you are probably right, probably doesn't really stand up in a court of law.
Yeah.
Probably doesn't justify locking someone up.
All right.
It's
So
evidence, hard facts, and 100%. So if you, yeah, I hope I'm explaining myself well enough here, but you
yeah.
get the idea how I see the systemic racism
Right. So basically,
manifesting.
yeah. So basically, let's also just quickly go back to this to the statistics, right? In South Africa, unfortunately, the majority of people that are disadvantaged economically
Yes,
are black. All right. We can't
yes,
dispute that. That is a given fact.
yes,
But what you're saying is,
yeah,
and I agree fully with you here, is it is not necessarily that a black person committed a specific crime at a specific time. That's basically
yeah,
what you're saying, and I fully
yes,
agree with that. And yes, I do, I do know one or two people, well, maybe more, given the age, like you also pointed out, the age of these people, that would believe that or prescribe prematurely, the racial
mm,
characteristics of the individual that broke the law.
yes.
But
And sorry, continue.
but surely, you know, we but surely we should be able to move beyond this whole sort of racial scope, right? So my thing is, before we continue, I want to put this question, and we can answer it after you've continued your thought. Is let's take for example the DA's new policies, right, on non-racialism and the way that the media has handled that. Would you say that that in and of itself is a form of systemic racism?
Um, Look, I don't think so necessarily to go out and for, let's say, on that one, for a political party going to say, we are going to adopt non-racial policies. That is almost like a bit of overcompensating. That's like a guy that's 5'6" wearing 6-inch heels. They're trying to overcompensate for something. They're trying to sell it. It's not necessary. All they could have done it today could just say these are our policies. And if a commentator from outside says, "Oh, but what about affirmative action? And what about racial injustices?" They can just say, "But listen here, this policy, the way it's structured here, addresses that issue without assigning specific races in the wording. And the reason, example, the reason why we're not going to do it like that is, should this policy become law in the country, don't want to open up the door for it to be abused 20, 30, 40 years down the line."
Brilliant.
That's all they needed to do. They didn't need to because that's what they're doing. They're trying to sell everybody. They're trying to convince everybody that they're not racist, which looks suspect.
Yes.
And it makes you look silly, quite frankly.
Well, I've, I think you hit the nail on the head there as well. I've never actually thought of it in that way. It's very interesting. Wow. Okay. Okay. Continue on with your trail of thought before I interrupted you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so like I said, that's the way where I see systemic racism in our society. And then in my opinion, you always also see almost like a positive feedback loop or negative feedback loop if you're talking about this specific subject, where because there's a portion of the population that immediately assigns race in negative scenarios like uh, criminal activities. They instinctively almost assign race without any evidence um, to the perpetrator. They would the it feeds back to um, the guys that are almost quote unquote falling victim to the systemic racism. So you will more likely see in South Africa, for instance, in impoverished black communities, um, especially youngsters, teenagers, especially males, saying, okay, well, I'm struggling, don't have enough food to eat, don't have clothes on my back, stuff like that. I'm just going to revert to criminal activities because everybody thinks already I'm a criminal. It's that almost like, it's almost a form of, okay, because I am, let's say, black, this is expected of me to do it this way. And then proceeding down that path because of the perception within certain groups of society,
Okay.
where you see that they would more likely just follow that train of thought. It's almost a situation of, well, if you're going to be judged guilty in any case, you might as well do the crime.
Yeah,
And
it's very
as
interesting.
it's it's not something that I personally have seen very, very often, but I have come across a few instances like that over the years where they just say, well, why should we put in effort to work hard and that if we can just go out, steal, rob, people expect that of us because I'm a young black man. And that is also, in my opinion, a manifestation of systemic racism, but it's almost self-inflicted.
Yes, it is definitely, and I think that is something that we as a society, can work um, towards better. You understand?
Yes.
Instead of
And
aiming for this, instead of jumping to these conclusions, um, because
I
let's
think,
face it, it's one person, like we've explained earlier. One person thinks because there's a crime committed that a specific person of a specific race, in this case black, would be the perpetrator, right? And that feeds back onto the black community in some way or form. Where the youngsters there think, well, these people think I'm a criminal, so I'm going to make it true. I'm going to be a criminal because, what else is there?
yes,
But this
you
also
see,
goes hand in hand with economic growth, I would think.
see, the way I see it is that where the problem comes in is you've got people on the, let's say, on the privileged side or your less impoverished side that immediately assigns race in certain to criminals and so forth, and immediately will assign race to people that are severely impoverished without any evidence or whatever. But it's almost like the stereotyping, but it's stereotyping to a very specific degree on a very specific characteristic, race, as we're discussing now. But what happens, or what I see happening is you've got this underlying racial issue, call it that, but now the government goes and tries to fix it.
Mm.
But they're not trying to fix the actual problem. They're trying to fix this built up this imaginary built up issue that we have, that South Africans, the races hate each other.
Mm.
So now they're trying to fix that with their redress policies. But and the redress policies combined with the social grant system. But now, because of their absolute and utter ineffectiveness and inefficiency of executing what they want to do, it creates disdain, or it creates a almost the okay. Sorry, kind of losing my words here, but the people that's supposed to benefit from their systems and from their programs, that's supposed to benefit from the affirmative action program, that's supposed to benefit from the social grant system, a lot of them is not getting what they are promised,
Mm.
which so they're disillusioned. First place, they become disgruntled. But now, because of the government keeps saying, "Oh, but this is the issue," the issue is the whites in the country are the issue. They are holding all the capital. They have a monopoly on the economy.
Mm.
So this is why it's not working, and that further disgruntles. And it's just statistic. Young males are. It's just biological. Doesn't matter which country you go, which culture. Sorry, which race. Your young males are more prevalent to, or more prone to erratic behavior and violent behavior.
Oh
It's
yes,
just
definitely.
biological. So
Yes,
if you put together the severe uh, income disparity or standard of living disparity in the country, along with the slight undertones of systemic racism, and the government trying to fix something, which we all know is possible for government to fix anything, no matter where you go, um,
precisely.
it
Yes.
it sets up for quite a big mess to happen. And if you go and look at our crime statistics, our crime statistics really hit second gear shortly after all these redress policies from the government was introduced. So as the government started ramping up their redress policies and their social grant systems, the crime rate also.
Oh, I lost you there.
Oh, sorry, okay.
Okay, there you're back.
Um, all right, sorry. Yeah, internet's very reliable in here in my area. What I was saying is, so if you go and look at the statistics, our crime statistics, around about the time or shortly after that, the government started ramping up their economic redress policies and started ramping up their social grants programs. Our crime rate also started climbing. And the more the government fiddles with the programs and the policies, the more the crime rate climbs. And I strongly suspect it's because that happens, because they're inefficient in executing their policies and their plans, it creates more distress amongst the people that they are trying to help to them.
Uh,
So by trying to fix it, they're making it worse.
yes,
And as the crime stats climb, the systemic racism that we talked about earlier escalates.
yes. So I want to quickly go back to redress and policies from the government before we move too far ahead, right?
Yes.
Because it's a multifaceted problem here. Because of the redress policies that they aim, which is racially based, you get things that D. Martin and I talked about, as well as Siv on some
Mm,
of the other topics, and I'll link those videos in the description as well for the
yeah.
people that haven't tuned into those podcasts. But in that, we said that you cannot have, for one, redress policies and have a Bill of Rights because the redress policies will undermine the rule of law, right?
Exactly.
Because
Yeah.
of a principle in the Constitution, which D and I talked about, called the fair discrimination, which is an oxymoron. It just doesn't work, right? So you either have to redress the past, and after you've redressed the past, you bring in your Bill of Rights, or you let go of the redress of the past and you implement the Bill of Rights. But rule of law needs to be the premise within the Bill of Rights. So on that as well, I had an interesting discussion with a person on social media, Twitter, and the example that he used was a school setting of sorts. And he said, well, imagine you were in school and there were two students, you're the teacher, and you gave more attention to one student over another. And the student that did not get enough attention, started to fail the class. But the student that got more than enough attention started to become successful in that class. Now you have to redress that. How do you do that? My answer to him was in a way that does not disadvantage the student that you already unfairly treated. So, in a way, you need to bring back the bar. You need to bring back fairness. And this brings us to another thing. So now, government is doing the exact opposite. They're ignoring the student, which was previously advantaged in this class. And the way that they are doing it is through their economic redress, through their broad based black economic empowerment program and affirmative action and equal equity, right? Effectively, now you've got systemic racism within South Africa permeating through every facet of life, basically. And then you also have institutionalized racism brought from the government top down onto the economy.
You see, my big issue with redress is, and I had this discussion with someone, I think on Twitter or something like that, is when did we discover time travel? Because last time I checked, if you drop a mug and it breaks, it's broken. you can try and stick it back together, but you're still going to see it was broken. If something is done, it's done. You can't undo. So to redress it, you can't walk back time. The best you can do is you can try set up the scenario, do things in a fashion that will benefit everybody going forward, or you leave the people that were well off to begin with, let them go on and set it and make changes that will allow the people that was disadvantaged to work themselves up again. And that didn't come back to the like with the DA's non-racial policies. If you the second, because that's what the government's doing, they're saying, okay, um, we have to the previous regime was bad. Okay, what are we going to do? Okay, we're going to take their policies and just flip it.
Yeah, because
It's
that's
never going
basically
to
what they
work.
did.
But now, not only are they going to flip it, now they're going to flip it, and they're going to uh, hamstrung the previously advantaged group, try and hold them back, while
Yes,
expecting them to pay um, to finance the program to uplift the previously disadvantaged,
yes. So,
which is sort of like sitting on a branch and sawing it off at the tree trunk.
oh yes. See, this is another
Not
thing
going to
that,
work.
yeah, this is another thing that this individual and I also discussed. I said, well, look, you disadvantaged, or yeah, you disadvantaged one of the two children, right? Now you need to work hard in order to bring the previously disadvantaged child back up to speed without disadvantaging the one that you've already advantaged, right? So you need to bring the playing field into an equilibrium of sorts. What we're finding is, like I said, instead of doing that, the ANC is, like you stated, sawing off the branch on which it's sitting. Um, and it's got disastrous effects, really
But
disastrous
to
effects.
sorry to run with your school analogy, what your ideal situation would be is you've got two students in the class. You want to give each student the amount of attention and support that that specific student needs,
Yes,
because you can just thinking back at school, not all the kids in the class were operating on the same level.
that's true.
Some of them were good at math, some of them were good at science. It differs. People differ from person to person. So you want to set up it in a way that each individual has to his disposal what he can choose. He has the tools that he needs to do what he wants to do.
Yes,
But the problem is, and this is general, and this started probably when we were still kids, is this idea of fairness, equality.
I would.
Fairness is if you try and implement fairness in life, you are going to fail every single time.
Well, I would
Because if there's
suggest.
one thing,
I would.
if there's one thing that life is not, it's fair,
Yes.
no matter what you do.
Yeah. What we mean with fair, however, is so. For example, again in the previous discussions, fairness, which should mean basically, if it counts for me, it counts for you, right? So if I do something wrong, the punishment that I receive must be equal to the punishment that you receive if you did that exact same thing as well, irrespective of your social class. But this idea of equality, like you pointed out, that to me is a bit of a poison that has seeped into our society, because now instead of, um, can I say this, maybe a social equality, but I'll need to find a better way to describe it perhaps. But yes, a social equality. We instead are looking for an or for a material equality. That to me is where the problem starts to seep in.
Yes, but now just on, like I said, with the punishment issue, is the problem is if you want to keep the punishment exactly the same across the board, then you have to then everybody that must have the same amount of knowledge. So, for instance, even in the law, your punishments won't be equal, because if you have someone that is a mentally disabled person committing a crime, the same crime as a normal person or a mentally healthy person, you can't punish both of them the same way, because the one person doesn't really understand what he did wrong in the first place. So the thing is, it's kind of difficult to word, but you don't want to You can't say everybody has to fit this mold,
Oh, I understand.
because that also doesn't work. You run into a myriad of problems doing it like that. You want to build a system that is where the people that want to work hard, that want to contribute, that want to benefit themselves and society are allowed to do that, but the system limits people that negatively influence society,
Yes.
and that's detrimental to society. But that you have to do that on a case by case basis, which is why we have judges and attorneys and all of that. That's
Mm.
why we don't have a clerk sitting there saying, okay, cool, what's your crime? Okay, speeding. Okay, the punishment for speeding with 60 kilometers an hour over the speed limit is X, and there you go.
Yeah.
Because then someone could have had a medical emergency or whatever. So you have to keep it, that portion of it must be flexible. Otherwise, it's going to be unfair at the end of the day,
Yes.
essentially.
See, this is why it's so important to have these sort of discussions, because you bring up a point that I did not take into consideration. So we can say fairness within circumstance. That
Yeah,
that
yeah.
would be a better description for
Yes,
what we
that
advocate,
fits.
because that what you are explaining is exactly what I was thinking, but you expressed it in such more clarity. So okay, so fairness in circumstance versus equality, material equality, can never be compatible in that. Um, it's a recurring theme, I think, that we always have to repeat, right? And it's all to do with this underlying root of systemic racism. And I find it very fascinating the way that you've defined it, because I think it fits. It fits better than what was explained as institutionalized racism. But now this is going to be very interesting. While we were talking, I wanted to see if my advanced English dictionary did have the definition of institutionalized racism. Are you ready for this?
Yes.
All right. So, the dictionary that I have says institutional. Now I'm falling off my words. Institutional racism is a form of racial inequality resulting not from conscious discrimination but from the cumulative effects of subconscious racism and or from the aggregate inertial discriminatory effect of individuals within a non-diverse group favoring like-minded individuals. Again, they're not talking specifically about the society. This to me, like we've spoken about, focuses more on the institutions within a given group or within a given society. So that could be governmental structures, it could be business structures, things like that.
Yeah, because if you think about it, you'll basically have you will have your institutionalized racism, you'll have your systemic racism, and then I would bring in a uh, almost want to say a not legalized racism, but there's a better word for it. I just know it. But so you can have the description you just read out would basically be in a the way I understood it in any case would be a company. There's nowhere in the company's procedures or rules or SOPs it's written down that we are not allowed to hire a person from race X, but
Mm.
because of the owner of the company's own biases or his own beliefs, that is a sort of it's you're told it's a common known fact that you're not going to a person from race X because the boss doesn't want it like that, but it's not written down. So it is not it's not black and white written down, but it is enforced within a structure, within a company, within a government,
See,
which is something that you do get. But if you get your like we have that you can argue that affirmative action and triple BEE, that is that is legitimized. That is written down black and white. That is basically legalized within the context of that organization.
yes,
Where the systemic racism, like I explained earlier, that is almost a knee-jerk reaction to
yes,
to an event. You'll have a knee-jerk reaction, and you'll tie race to in that specific scenario.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily have to affect like or lead to the idea of crime. It's basically any sort of subjective idea or prejudice that you hold towards a certain specific race, right? So, for
Yeah.
example, taking again this employment thing, this is where Siv and I would basically bring up ethics, right? And what does our ethics bring us? Because our ethics would lead us to our economic and political system, is what we've been arguing. Um, and this forms really part of that. And it's really fascinating that people are struggling with this. Because sometimes I also struggle with these concepts. You know, it's not. People think it's easy. It's not that easy, right? It's easy for you to identify systemic racism within other structures or within society as a whole. It's not so easy to identify it within your own organization. You have to be, first and foremost, be aware of that. And only then, once you become aware of it, you start to work towards becoming less prejudiced towards other people. And that's when I think you really start to grow up in terms of the social cohesion, if that makes sense.
It's something, and there's also something I think a lot of people disregard or don't take into account is that there's reasons other than race why you would have certain, can I say, imbalances or disproportionate representation with the organization.
Oh, yes.
Um, so you've got geographic issues. Your geography will play a part. Where I mean by that is what social groups, what tribes, if I can use that crude word, is present in a certain geographic area. Because
Mm-hmm.
it's going to be very, very, can I say, silly to throw a hissy fit because there's not enough um, Japanese speaking people working in a big company in Pretoria. That's just never going to happen
Yeah,
because how many Japanese speaking people are there in South Africa in a whole?
yeah.
Not a
See,
lot. And you get that if you run that through just through South Africa, you get got 11 official languages to start with. So best case scenario, you've got 11. If you assign languages to larger tribes or larger social groupings, you're going to have 11 different ones, and they are centered in certain geographic locations. So depending on where a certain company is, you're going to be more likely to have people that speak the same home that has the same mother tongue working in companies. And it goes further than that because each tribe, each social grouping has its own um, flavor, if you that. And you see that across all the languages. And then within a certain language group, you'll also get differences.
absolutely.
Because if you take Afrikaans speaking people from Pretoria and their social dynamics, compare that to Afrikaans people speaking people in Cape Town, and their dynamics, how they interact with each other, is completely different.
Oh, yes, much
Not
different.
not complete, not completely different,
Yeah,
but there's certain subtle differences. So you will have, if a majority is working already, someone that doesn't fall in that specific group naturally, will there's a good chance that they will not feel as welcome or as part of the group as they would do when they were surrounded by someone of their own group of people, their own tribe of people. Put it that way.
absolutely. See, this is something also that I wrote about in 2018. Yes, I wrote a letter to a doctor, a psychologist, or I can't, anyway, one of those kopdokters, as my spouse would
Mm,
say. And in that, in that response, it was in response to a black woman in Cape Town, for example, and even there she felt left out because of the massive culture difference between Cape Town and Johannesburg, two cities on the same continent in the same country, but the cultures were vastly different. She felt out, and she basically blamed, racial stereotypes,
mm,
yeah, for this feeling. But for me, it was like, no, it was more complicated than that. You can't just ascribe these differences, these things, only to race. Culture plays a role. language plays a role, and as you've pointed out, geography, also plays a role. All
Mm.
these things culminates into whether or not a company is going to, the look of the company, if you want, the diversity within the company, if you will. But of course, there's much more than just racial diversity. There's diversity of thought as well. For me, personally, I think that in order to overcome systemic racism, government needs to not step in as much as it already has, right? So we already see new broad-based black economic empowerment proposals on the table where the minister can basically enforce you to bring forth your transformation target, which you've put down on black and white. For me, that will worsen the social or systemic racism within South Africa. It's not going
No,
to,
no doubt.
yeah, it's not going to help it. It's not healthy. In fact, personally, everything where government is involved, you can bet like there's an 80-20% chance that it's going to fuck up.
No, yeah. But just to on that specific example you brought up with the lady from Johannesburg moving to Cape Town, and that also highlights another issue for me is people they kind of elude your workplace with social setting.
Yes,
And I've seen it plenty of times in different industries where someone will say, "But I don't feel welcome." Well, are they making your work? Are they preventing you from doing your work? Okay, no. So then, what's the issue? It's you're not at a social gathering. You guys aren't supposed to. You're not getting paid to discuss what you did over the weekend. You're there to perform your job.
absolutely.
And I think that is an issue. It's this pampered way in which a lot of parents raise their kids, where they want to give their kids a better life than they had, but they neglect the value of hard learned lessons or a bit of like I said, difficulties experienced in childhood, because now they're going everywhere and they expect everyone to be their best friend, which you not it's not a realistic goal to go into a workplace with. What you want in a workplace is you want someone that doesn't hamper you to do your work. You work well together. That's as far as it's supposed to go. Well, not supposed to go, but that's what you need to do your job. As long as you're not fighting and they're not trying to block you around and trying to bad to the boss and all of that nonsense, you do your job, you go home, and then you can have your social setting. And you see a form of that. The other thing that bothers is people fail to assimilate, or they don't want to assimilate. And you see that if people move from one town to another, from Joburg to Cape Town or to another country or whatever, they they go to a completely different place, different town, different cultures, different people, effectively, and they expect it to be the same as where they come from, which is also just it's not going to work like that. If you put a single drop of white paint into 20 liters of red paint, it's still going to be red paint.
Yes.
It's not going to magically turn white.
Yeah, you need to assimilate into the culture where you move into first and foremost in your social setting, but in your work setting. And this is something that I've taught my younger sibling and my cousins and my nephews and my nieces is keep business at business and keep your home life at your home life, right?
Yes.
Don't go to a braai with your colleagues, although that's my opinion, because I've seen how households have been broken apart because of bullshit that's happened at work and all that. It's
Yeah, I've got exactly the same rule. I do not fraternize with my colleagues, with the one caveat. You always have the chance of that you actually there's someone that you work with that you would have been friends with outside of the workplace in any
yes,
case.
yeah,
But
and
even then, I have a hard and fast rule that I will not socialize with that person as long as we work together. So the
yes,
second one of us resigns and moves on, then we can be friends from
yeah,
there on out.
because there. Otherwise, what I've seen in a previous company that I worked for was rumors spread like wildfire. And
Mm.
I was sitting there and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, What have these people invited into their own lives? I do not want to hear any rumors, I do not want to be part of any rumors, and I do not want to start any rumors. So that is why that rule is there, and it's a rule I think a lot of people need to start to adopt as well.
Yeah, you can have that. That's one of the issues, and one of the other things that can happen is on a subconscious level, your social life, your home life, and your work life start to bleed across. And what I've seen a lot of the times happen, especially in your more blue collar workplaces, is where the guys go out for a drink after work, and becomes two drinks and three drinks, and then it becomes one. It's from one night a week to two nights a week. At the end of the day, you're spending 40-50% more time with your colleagues that you should have been spending at home. And like I said, that just destroys the home life and your social life completely, because
Absolutely.
it upsets the balance completely.
Mm. And this is something that I've found now. Like I do work for a lot of other companies, and so I've got all of these people on my other social medias on because to keep in contact with me, but I don't post anything about my family. I don't post anything about my home or anything like that, right? I might post something from my garden, like, oh, hey, check this rose or whatever the case may be. But that is not the same as putting up a picture of your daughter or a picture of your son or a picture of your husband or your wife, whatever the case may be. There needs to be that clear delineation. The colleagues need to know, like, these are the bounds and they will not overstep them. And it's very
And
important
that's
that you enforce that. Very important because you get persistent people out there. But coming back to systemic racism, the problem with this also, once you start to mingle business with home, is that people then subconsciously, we can use that word, start to judge you based on what they know of your personal life.
yeah, that lot.
Yeah, so I've seen, for example, how people say that, for example, homophobia isn't a thing. Well, I've actually seen homophobia happen. The guys didn't understand that it was happening, but it was definitely happening because they knew the personal life of that individual. Look, personally, I don't care who you are married with. That's my stance. I don't even want to know, right? If we're colleagues, I really don't want to know because I've seen this shit happen. And
See,
yeah,
see, that brings up another issue that I've picked up, and that is how people apply a lot of definitions, like the words racism, homophobia, xenophobia, all of those things. Okay, to just to give you an idea what I'm getting at here, let's take homophobia. Um, that living on the farm in the Free State that gets a bit disgusted when he sees two young chaps holding hands walking down the street or kissing each other or whatever. He's just disgusted because for his personal set of values, that's not right.
yes,
Okay. But he like turns up his nose and he goes home and he gives his wife an earful about that, or he chats with the dominee or whatever. Okay. That versus, let's take the instance of xenophobia in South Africa, where they pull foreign truck drivers out of the truck and beat them to. Now, that's xenophobia. Those guys are acting purely based on the fact that that truck driver was not a South African, he's a foreign national.
precisely.
Where the Wimmy in the middle of the Free State, he's not acting on it. It's just not in line with his personal values. Now, to call him homophobic, in my opinion, would be wrong
And
because
I
he's
would
not
agree.
picketing outside. He's not picketing outside the guy's house. He's not harassing them at work and trying to get them chased out of town by an angry mob. He's
Yes,
just, for him personally, it's not on. But he leaves it at that and he goes about his business. So now, to just because to call him homophobic, in my opinion, is not applying the term wrong. And that's something we see a lot these days, is where people get called all sorts of things, from Nazis and homophobic, racists and whatever, but it's not applicable in the situation. It's just not.
precisely.
And it comes back to the systemic racism thing. Just because that guy assumed the gender of the guy, of the race and the gender obviously as well, of the guy that broke into his car, doesn't, how's that his idea in his head, how's that affecting The police isn't, or the police is not supposed to go off his hunch, investigate it from that angle. They're supposed to work with the evidence. So, yes, that could be a form of systemic racism because he assumed the race and, like I said, the gender. But does that really change anything? Does that negatively affect anyone?
You see, this is now something very interesting because I would say that systemic racism, even though it might not be acted upon, can certainly lead to institutionalized or legalized, as we said earlier, for lack of a better word, can certainly lead to these sort of legislations and policies which can lead to institutionalized racism. That would be for me the actual acting of
Of it.
of it.
No, look, it's not. It doesn't take a. It's not a stretch to run the thought experiment that if you've got, look, if you've got one, let's take South Africa. If you've got 100 people that think the way as described in the initial scenario with the car breaking into a car, 100 people, that's not going to change anything. That's not going to have any meaningful impact on the country in general. But if you start to get 1 million or 2 million people that's got the same sort of train of thought, and they own companies and they work in companies and they are in government, then yes, that could start bleeding out into institutionalized racism. It's not a stretch to run to that point. But the thing is, if you the only way to curb that is through your basic quote unquote education. People, discussions like this and all the other discussions that you have around the topic, um, where so that people can hear the different opinions, the different viewpoints, and then sort of over the years you can get that phased out. Um, but to go and create legislation to try and get it out is never going to work.
No, because it has to happen on an individual level.
It's
Um, it's definitely an individual choice that you have to make consciously. Uh,
yeah,
you can't force it onto others because forcing it, people. This is another observation that I've made, and I've made it in myself as well. The moment that you tell people what to do in a certain circumstance and with a certain amount of force, then they will either do one of two things. They'll either rebel against you, right, depending on the amount of force that you've used, or they will capitulate and do it out of fear. But that hasn't changed the mindset, the inner workings of that individual. That individual will still hold to that prejudiced thoughts or that prejudiced feelings that they harbor deep inside of them.
just a nice example of that. If let's take South Africa for instance, and you go back to let's say 1940, the norm was that the husband works, the wife stays at home and raises the kids. That was the norm.
Yes,
And slowly, generationally, over the years, that has gone to the point where the majority of households in South Africa, most likely, um, both the husband and the wife works. So if you were to go and tomorrow pass a law that says women have to stay at home and look after the kids, it'll cause it'll cause untold amounts of issues. Even if you roll a similar type of law in over 5 years, it's still going to be a mess because
absolutely.
to change to societies doesn't change in 5 or 10 years. Societies change over generations, and there's a very good reason for that. Because if when societies were still in agrarian phases or hunter-gatherer phases, if you change something too quickly, and no one eats. If you decide from 1 year to the next, okay, no, we're not going to plant here this year, we're going to plant in another field that wasn't prepared yet, you're going to have a bad crop year. So things are societies. That's how societies develop. It's doing the same thing over and over and over and over, and slowly over time, tweaking it and adapting it, get it to work better and better and better. The problem, and that's, in my opinion, why government interference always fail or nearly always fails, is because they're trying to do it too quickly. They're
Absolutely
trying
agree
to
with that.
go against our biological hardwiring and the pace at which societies evolve. Which is why I
Absolutely.
say a much more effective way would be just to allow people to do. You don't want people to act on their biases and on their prejudices, but you You want to leave it so that it slowly phases in the direction that you want it to go, to better the society. But like
Absolutely.
we said, the minute you institutionalize it, where you pass laws that try and force people to do it in a certain way, and in South African context, you run into two issues. You run into resistance from in the business setup. You run into resistance from the company owners and the people that run the businesses and their workers. You run into resistance on their side because you're forcing them to do something that they do not feel comfortable and
Yes.
that, which they don't deem to be fair. The other problem that you have is we've got a massive education backlog, and our educational standards are horrendous. So now you're forcing people into a workforce which are not, they don't have the educational training for it, or the experience for it, and they're getting put into jobs just for the sake of getting them into the jobs, which means your productivity is going to take a nosedive
Just to fill in that quota system is or
just to fill in the quota system.
yes.
And this has a even further knock-on effect because now your productivity drops. So now you have to employ more people, which means your profits go down, salaries stay low because you have to employ more people, which means effectively the less money goes into the economy because it gets sucked up. Because everybody for the money to actually properly flow back into the economy, people need to earn above a certain threshold. And that's a variable threshold depending on lots of economic factors. But if you pay everyone R1,000 a month, the effect is going to be a lot less pronounced on the economy, or is not as much expendable income is going to be available in there than when you pay half of or a quarter of those people R5,000. So your
Yes.
industries are going to be very limited. Your whole economy won't develop because there's not enough excess. There's not enough people that have disposable income.
Yes. And
There's too many people that have survival income.
yes. And unfortunately, the amount of money within the economic system will determine the economic output of that system.
Mm.
So the more, can we say, I hate this word, the more capital that is floating within the system, the better the chances that that system will develop along that lines. The infrastructure would develop so that your education can develop, so that your society can develop, because it's a vice versa sort of thing, right? Society develops along infrastructure, and infrastructure develops along society. But if society stagnates with that capital, with the amount of capital within the economic system, the infrastructure stagnates, and then that whole society just comes crumbling down. Interesting, most of my clients have stopped looking for work inside of South Africa. They're looking towards Africa, broader Africa, so Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique, Gabon, etc. And also in Europe, Macedonia, Greece, um, Germany is also another key market that they're looking into. Uh, this is another problem with legalized racism, can we say, with this whole quota system. You can't compete with people that, or with a company that rather employs the best instead of trying to fill a quota system and has enough profit to take on more riskier projects overseas, right? So what the companies now are starting to do is they're starting to look outside of South Africa's borders for work. The problem with this is that it does not empower South Africans on the lower rungs of the economic scale, right?
It's absolutely detrimental for the country as a whole because those companies are looking for work outside of South Africa, which means
Absolutely.
there's physically going to be money going that would have been spent inside of South Africa is now going to be spent outside of South Africa. And when you go to manufacturing and they start outsourcing the manufacturing of it, like America has with China, that capital goes out of the country. It's not coming back,
Yes.
and you are putting money in the pockets of poor people in another country. You're effectively helping another country to keep afloat instead of helping your own country.
Precisely.
And that's one thing. If you look at minimum wage and unionization and all of that, that has absolutely hurt South Africa's economy because that's why companies would rather started looking at employing people from Zimbabwe and other countries because they're willing to go at least start off or work for less money, and the union issue doesn't come in. Because
Precisely.
now at the end of the day, South Africa's got an insanely high, expensive, high tax rate on individuals and companies, and that's just the primary tax. That's not all the secondary, unseen or hidden taxes like your private security and all of that we. So the guys need to cut at certain costs need to be cut to be able to keep the company running, to be able to produce. So they put these policies in place because they think they're going to help the workers, but at the end of the day, there's so much restriction, so much laws that limits everything that they're basically smothering it. So they're slowly just smothering the whole system. The whole economy is being smothered, and in an attempt to keep afloat, because that's the what people and everyone will. Most people, most countries will do this, is they will fight tooth and nail to stay afloat, to stay alive, because they want to survive. That's a basic instinct. So the people want the companies to survive, so then they look for labor that's less cumbersome than the South Africans to employ South Africans, and then that capital also goes out of it. But now the South Africans are unemployed, they get uppity, and then the poor foreign nationals start getting it because they're saying they're stealing their jobs.
Yes. Which I
When
also
actual
disagree.
fact is,
I sort of understand their plight, right?
mm,
But I disagree with them because they didn't hold the job at to begin with. You cannot steal
yeah,
what you didn't own, or
yes,
something
but the thing
cannot be
is,
stolen which was not owned. But I understand the
yeah,
sentiment.
but the blame is being placed in the wrong on the wrong people.
Yes,
They're placing the
definitely,
blame on the foreign
definitely.
nationals instead of placing it on the government, which created the environment that facilitated the foreign nationals to get the job over South Africans.
Yes,
But that's the one thing is if you look at the systemic racism, it is, and this is if you look at all the different issues we have, what the government does to try and fix or redress the unredressable and your basic slight how biases and um, beliefs that people hold. If you put all of that together, it just the one feeds into the other one the whole time. And every time the government tries to meddle or someone tries to force people to do things in a certain way, just adds into that. It puts more energy into that cycle the whole time. So,
exactly.
and this is why I sort of took a bit of an offense to the discussion that Dr. Haley had, but because she is a philosopher, she studied philosophy, um, and yeah, I might be holding certain people to a bit higher standard, but I felt that the conversation could have just as well been had with two people off of the street, because there was no. It felt very ill. It didn't feel if it was well thought through. They took the narrative that the discussion, because there's a discussion that there was nothing wrong with it, but it's the same discussion that countless of people have had before on podcasts and YouTube channels and so on. And there was no thinking outside of the box. One YouTube channel that I follow, I don't know if you've seen this stuff, Brain in a Vat.
Actually, I have not.
You should check that out. It's well worth a watch. It's guy's got long hair and a beard. In any case, it's two philosophers, all right? And they have the show, and then they'll have other philosophers on there and they'll discuss a certain topic. What I like about that is they would take the topic of racism, for instance, and they would discuss it, and then one of the two hosts will deliberately go and play devil's advocate. They would go, they look for other ways of approaching it. And that's one of the big things that kind of got a gripe with is people discuss the topics, but it's basically just a rehash of what's been said over and over and over again. They're not looking at other contributing factors. They're not looking at another way to from a different perspective to see if there isn't something else that could be influencing the issue. Because if you think about it, like we said with the cultural differences, if you move from Pretoria to Cape Town, for instance, or if you move from Joburg to Bloemfontein, you're going to have the same cultural differences within the racial groups, and you are naturally going to have a certain amount of disparity and overrepresentation or underrepresentation in all spheres of the society, depending on where you are and what the majority culture is there. And now people go and once again, like I said earlier, they slap a label on something to try and justify meddling in it and try to make it equal. Oh no, there's too many white kids in this school. This is a problem. Or there's too many Afrikaans learners in this university. That is a problem.
Yes.
Um, but the problem is not that university. The problem is there's kids that's in a school in Guyana who has to go to school under a tree, which means if it rains, they can't have class. That's a problem. But to try and say that if you change this university or this school's demographic, that's not going to change the problem. Those kids in Guyana are still going to be sitting under a freaking tree. You need
Yes.
to get a school built there. And
Yes.
one of the things that I've been saying for years is instead of forcing companies or forcing schools to have to meet certain quotas or forcing companies to meet certain quotas, leave the companies, let them employ whoever they want to, and stop taxing them to death and tell them, listen here, let's say your tax bracket for your company is, for argument's sake, 30%. But if you take X amount for every X amount of money that you put into developing the education system, for building schools, putting money into schools so that they can better the school, train the teachers better, and all of that. For every X amount, for every £1,000, for instance, that you put in, you get 0.1% off of a tax break. That's going to be a much more effective way to redress, quote unquote, the issues that we have that's definitely we're sitting with because of previous governmental laws.
Absolutely
There's
agree.
much better ways to do it, but to try and failing to come to the word, but trying to force every people into a certain box, into a certain solution, it's always going to be a mess. Because as we saw now tonight, look at how wide discussion we've had already, and
Yes.
all of that influences your systemic and your institutionalized and racism in general, and just the general dynamic country between the people in the. So it's that old thought experiment where that's used as an argument against centralized planning. If you go and look at a pencil, just take a normal HB pencil, and you go and look at how many people and how many companies are involved to get that pencil from a tree and some dirt to in a kid's hand in school.
Yes.
The amounts of material, the amounts of processing, the amounts of manufacturing and transportation and all of that that goes into it is staggering. It is absolutely mind blowing. So if something as simple as a pencil is that complex, how you can just imagine how complex a society is with all the different facets. Which is why, which is brings me back to why I took a bit of an issue with how they describe systemic racism because they approached it from, and a lot of people do that, not just them, but they approach it from the point where, oh, a society is 1 + 1 + 1 gives you 3, which is not how a society works. It's such a multifaceted, and it's an organism. If you think about it, it functions as an organism.
Yes.
It develops, it grows, and it adapts to its surroundings and all of that. So it's so complicated and so complex that to try and fix one issue or two issues with a couple of rules and laws is absurd. It's absolutely absurd.
I totally
Especially
agree.
when we can sit here and have this conversation for the next year non-stop, and there's still going to be things that we're going to miss. Still going to be small things that influences it that we are not going to think of.
Yes. So just to get back on something that you've mentioned, like for
Mm,
example, maybe the tax breaks on companies to help invest into society. I've said that to Jimmy, for example, in the past, where he was trying to advocate for gender equality and racial
mm,
equality within. I'm sure you've seen that as well, where I said
mm.
I don't think it's how you handle it, and I totally agree with you. Incentivize businesses and individuals to invest within society. We can see this in work, in actual working condition in Zambia, for example, and in
Yes.
what is the other one? It was Zambia, and I think it was Tanzania, but I stand corrected on that one. But I definitely saw it in Zambia, for especially with the mining industry, where the mines get tax rebates or tax reductions if they help build infrastructure like roads, sanitation, stormwater drainage, etc., even schools to some degree. Um, and the mines do it because, taxes impact on profit, and they make enough to help the society. And in doing that, they uplift that society as well. A very, very, very important point that you brought up there. Um,
I'm glad you brought up Zambia. Sorry to interrupt, but I don't know if you've seen how Zambia handled their land their farming issue or their land issue, as we call it here in South Africa. What they did is because can't remember the president, he basically pulled a Robert Mugabe, chased all the white farmers out of South Africa, confiscated their farms, and after he stepped down as president, he went back to his successor, and he said, okay, listen here, we kind of stuffed up. So the plan that they came up with is they got quite a few of the white farmers back, and they said, okay, we'll give you, there's your farm, but here's the deal: you are going to take on a certain amount, for every certain amount of hectare, you're going to take on one local farmer. That farmer is going to work with you, and you're going to train him for 3 or 4 or 5 years. And at the end of that time, we are going to give that farmer his own farm. And you go on with your farm and you take on the next apprentice, quote unquote.
and
And that system,
that's
as in my opinion, it's slow, which is apparently a swear word in South Africa,
yes,
especially when it comes to government. Nothing can take, it must be sustainable and long term. Everything must happen overnight. But it's proved very, very successful because the farmers that came out of that, the black farmers that came out of that program, is they're efficient and they're effective and they're producing on a high level
and
because they got the training. So they got the training from the farmer that already knew how to do it. And they did that in a manner which did not negatively affect the farmer that helped them to keep that system going. But like I said, in South Africa, especially with the ANC, yeah, sustainable and long term is a swear word.
absolutely. See, this is where it gets interesting because for me, that is a form of redress done right. Okay,
Yes.
without how can I say disadvantaging the farmer and giving enough advantage or fairness towards the previously disadvantaged. That to me is a system that can work. Martin, we have
Yes.
reached over an hour. We've been going for an hour and 15 minutes. This is actually
Nice.
a very fascinating topic, and I'm actually glad that you brought this up and brought this to my attention. I'm very, very, very grateful to you. Is there any closing statements that you want to make?
Mm, mm, Other than I can think of offhand, just a yeah,
Just a yeah. So, in other words, be cool,
just
people. Don't be a
yeah,
doers.
just don't, rule number one: don't be a doers.
Just
Rule
like
number
that.
two: refer to rule number one. But yeah, no, it was
Absolutely.
great chatting to you. Thanks for having me, and yeah,
Okay, no,
it was
definitely.
fun.
We shall definitely have to make a part two. Um,
Yeah.
and we'll have to talk about because there's a lot of things that I've made. I do make notes, so there's a lot of things that we can talk about, whether it's the education system, unionization, minimum wage, or xenophobia, or any of the other myriad things that we talked about. You let me know. Guys, with that as well, remember that the fruit of the Spirit grows like a tree. It isn't like the works of the flesh that's immediately. So transformation needs to happen slowly over time. You can't hasten it. When you hasten it, the system falls apart, society falls apart, and this is where systemic racism then leads into legalized, or as we called it, institutionalized racism. Guys, and with that bang, thank you, Martin, again. Thank you guys for listening. If you like this, please subscribe, give it a thumbs up, and share it all around. Until next time, cheers.
Cheers.